Fantasy and sci-fi is full of gods. Gods meddling, gods dying, and characters trying to become gods and then discovering it's not all it's cracked up to be. Being a god might seem like a fantastic life at the start, all that power, right? But the more we look at these stories, the more we start to wonder if, well, maybe being a god is even harder than being human. Like, let me tell you a story. This is the great god Om, except he isn't all that great at the moment because he's a tortoise. Om wants to think he's the all-powerful god of Omnia, but upon manifesting himself in the world, he's discovered that basically nobody truly believes in him anymore. Not really. Most people just say they do for money or power or because joining the priesthood is indoor work with no heavy lifting. In fact, the little tortoise Om learns that across the whole world, he only has one true believer left, a dimwit called Brutha. One man's belief barely keeping him alive. Om and Brutha's little adventure comes from one of my favorite Discworld novels, Terry Pratchett's Small Gods. And this divine little tortoise, suddenly feeling not so divine anymore, spends most of the story learning just how hard it is to be a god again. By the way, I can only make long-form educational content like this because of my patrons who very generously support me. If you like educational content like this, consider joining me over there. Genuinely, literally only possible because of them. At the start, Om wants to believe that he doesn't need all these puny little mortal humans. "I'm a god," he cries. "I don't have to think like this. I don't have to put myself in the power of a human." But I remind you, he's not so much a god as he is a tortoise. And he starts to wonder that, in a way, humans don't need gods as much as they need them. In a lot of fantasy, for all their immense power and glory and majesty, gods really aren't above humanity and mortals so much as utterly dependent on them for their fickle, often desperate and changing, even selfish belief. Because gods embody us, our ideas, our nations, and ideas wax and wane. They die. In these stories, a god's only lifespan is the life we give them. And Om fears nothing more than being cast out into the desert where the little gods that nobody believes in anymore live. Humans, on the other hand, you and me, we just get to be. Be who we are, no strings attached. We don't come with built-in destinies and jobs, at least not ones we can easily figure out. When you fall down in a forest with nobody around, you still make a sound. A god, not so much. Of course, there are tons of different gods in fantasy and fiction. Capital G gods, little g gods, all who work different ways and with different magic systems. But the idea that they rely on belief turns up all the time in fantasy. And there's actually a really fascinating version of this in Rick Riordan's Heroes of Olympus series. We learn the gods suffer from a kind of split personality disorder. Their very minds divided between their Greek versions, Zeus, Hades, Poseidon, etc., and their Roman versions, Jupiter, Pluto, Neptune. Two identities at war within the same god because of how their believers below envision them differently, a religious schism of sorts, and these gods are forced to fit that mold. The Roman sides are more disciplined and militaristic, their Greek sides more relaxed and cool dude, but this division paralyzes them in the story. It literally prevents them from acting coherently, from even having a grip on their identity. This whole trope is sometimes referred to as mythopoeia in fantasy, making myths where human belief shapes gods, even shapes reality. These stories explore the power of human belief and imagination, how our ideas shape the world we live in, that we don't just live in a world of flesh and blood, but of ideas and philosophies. As Terry Pratchett writes, we get the gods we deserve, we get the gods we make. Tangent, but apparently in Warhammer 40k, the orcs are so dumb, but they have this magic ability where if they believe something hard enough, it just becomes reality. Like they believe that their terrible machines work, and so they do. Being a god might give you power and influence, but it can also mean living in a prison defined by the beliefs about you of others. We remember our gods when we're desperate and stuck in gridlock traffic, but we forget them when life is good. As Om discovers in Small Gods, only loved insofar as they give people power. But I think the greatest burden of being a god is probably the one you first thought of. Gods are powerful in ways we aren't, in ways we will never be. But with great power comes a lot of paperwork, responsibility. Towards the end of the book, Om explodes with power once more when war breaks out and people cry out to him for help. Om wants to defend his people. He's learned his lesson, how to be a god. He wants to strike the enemy down. "I could make them as dust," he cries. But Brutha says, "No, you can't do that. That'd be worse than war. Worse? Why? Isn't a god meant to protect their people? Isn't that the whole point of all of this power? Why have this power if you're not going to use it when it matters most? In this way, a lot of these stories explored the nature of power, of divine intervention, of why God doesn't help. And to really answer that question, I have to tell you about another book, which is quite aptly named Hard to Be a God, by Soviet-era writers Arkady and Boris Strugatsky. Very straight to the point with the title.
I know writers who use subtext, and they're all cowards.
Imagine a super advanced utopian civilization watching over a medieval planet as it descends into fascism. Mass executions, purges, roaming death squads they call grey troopers. It has it all. This is a bad world to be in. But you know that old phrase that sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic? Well, sufficiently advanced technology also makes them indistinguishable from a god to these people. Sci-fi has a long history of using ultra-advanced civilizations and technology as a metaphor for godlike power. Stargate, Star Trek, Elder Race shows up all the time. And in Strugatsky's book, one man called Anton is ordered to just watch and observe all of this, to not interfere while all this horrible stuff happens right in front of him. But he refuses. He intervenes and instead poses as a godlike figure to the dictator of this world, kind of like what wanted to do. This book ends with a philosophical discussion over how much a god could or ever should intervene. Anton suggests that maybe gods should give everyone food and clothing and shelter. I mean, they could easily do that. It wouldn't even cost them much money at all. I mean, they have the technology to do it easily. They could give them all they need. But another man argues that if God did that for them, then they would, quote, lose the zest of life. So Anton argues, well, okay, use their godlike technology to maybe make people love working and life and pursuing knowledge and exploring, keep the zest of life. But again, the man disagrees, saying, would it not be the same thing as wiping mankind off the face of the planet and creating a new mankind in its place? This is the worst thing that Terry Pratchett alludes to, that God intervening would deprive us of free will, of even our nature, that it would turn us into puppets. And faced with this, Anton says, no, I'm done. If I can't help this planet, I'm just going to walk away. I'm going to abandon it. But he finds he can't. He can't look away from the suffering he knows is happening, that he knows he could help. Their burden is that of a parent, to watch their child get hurt and cry and know that they need to do this for themselves from time to time if they are to grow. The burden of a god here is to look upon their creation on what they love most, to watch all this cruelty and suffering, to want to help so desperately, to have the power to do so, and only be able to offer pity. This dilemma actually shows up in a bunch of really interesting ways in Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere, especially the Mistborn series, which is full of characters ascending to godhood. In one book, the god Harmony fears they made life too easy for mankind by interfering once before. They created the perfect climate where people didn't need to struggle to survive, they didn't need to struggle to explore, to innovate, and Harmony even says they were meant to have radio technology years ago, but people just never invented it because they lost their zest for life, just like Strugatsky warns. The Doctor from Doctor Who is regularly described as a, quote, lonely god, someone with vast technological power and knowledge. They can time travel, they can intervene anywhere and anytime they want, and ultimately they are the only ones who can carry that burden. Even their companions who travel with them are temporary, often die, they don't come back to life the way the Doctor does. And that pain weighs so heavily on the Doctor that one of the best episodes is all about the Doctor breaking under the strain of that godly burden and intervening where they shouldn't.
The laws of time are mine, and they will obey me!
When I started looking into all of this, I immediately thought of this Superman comic I've come across a few times before. I'm not really a big Superman person, but it has always really stuck with me. Superman has to take the place of Atlas for a day, the Greek god who carries the world. And he's told not to carry it with his muscles, but with his heart. He sees and hears all the troubles, hopes, joys, and pains of the world Atlas carries in a way humans never have to. We get to live inside our little bubble. We can shut out the pains of the world anytime we want. Ignorance is bliss in a way. But a god doesn't get to do that. All Superman can do is hold it and empathize. The burden of a god isn't just the burden of power, but awareness, constant awareness of all the suffering we know exists but don't have to face directly. Every god is lonely in that way, and they have no one to pray to. And can you imagine how much all of that would weigh on you emotionally, spiritually, and how easy it would be to just become numb to all of it? Not just the little sufferings, but the big ones. And Hard to Be a God actually points this out pretty explicitly in saying, "It seems that the reservoirs of humanism in our souls, which seemed bottomless on Earth, dry up at an alarming rate. The worst thing is to lose your humanity, Anton, to sully your soul, to become hardened. We're gods here, and we need to be wiser than the gods from the legends." The burden of a god is that it would be so easy to just stop caring, to even become resentful. In fact, all of that is exactly what happens in Small Gods, because at the start of this battle, shoots off to try and negotiate with the gods of other nations to stop this from happening, and he finds them, guess what? Gambling on the human lives of the people about to die down below, and all the horrible things which might happen, because to them, quote, "they're gonna die anyway, aren't they?"
So I've decided to blow up Earth.
In our little limited lives and perspective, we can't help but care all the time, but a god has to find ways to keep caring. Some fantasy stories take that question and ask, what kind of world evolves when God stops caring, when he abandons his creation? And we often get some really interesting world building from that as other entities fill in the vacuum. And with all of these stories, it might seem like gods are kind of like these distant, otherworldly entities which have no relation to humanity. But the reality is, we face decisions like this every day in the real world. Or if not today, then we will in the future. There are still uncontacted tribes in some areas of the world, in India, in Papua New Guinea, and for a long time, humanity kind of thought it was our duty to intervene, to give them technology and civilization and religion, but the world has kind of come around to believing that maybe we should just leave them alone. We should observe, we should stick out a way, and part of that is just letting them die. Or what about terraforming other planets? Should we ever exercise that kind of godlike power? We're already changing our own planet enough. The only difference between us and a god here is that humanity at least gets to share this burden together, that when we forget to care, when we grow numb to it, we meet other people who haven't and we find new ways to care again. But don't worry, skeptics, I can already hear you tippity-tappity typing away in the comments, because we do have to ask, how much of this is true? Would God intervening really destroy free will and humanity as we know it? Even just a little bit of intervention? How much of this is just excuses? How much of this is, cope? Would it really matter if God provided a little more fresh water for the world, or made sure those few bullets missed those kids, or maybe helped you with that job that you worked really hard to get? Fantasy and sci-fi, as much as the real world, have wrestled with these questions for decades. And even though it might seem like Hard to Be a God is saying, yes, actually it would be that bad, I want to point to something very specific, because there is a really interesting line in the foreword to the book from novelist and author Hari Kunzru, which suggests otherwise. Conned by his rules of engagement, Anton seems less like a god than a trickster, a semi-divine raven or a Nancy or coyote mixed up in situations rather than standing transcendentally above them. Anton here is described as a trickster, and trickster characters appear in mythologies all over the world. Loki, Anansi, Hermes, Maui, gods who push boundaries, who do the taboo thing, not necessarily good or evil, but one interesting trait which keeps coming up is how tricksters help humanity where the gods don't want them to. It's Prometheus who breaks the rules and gives humanity fire and mathematics and civilization, where Zeus didn't want him to. It's Maui who not only teaches humanity how to make fire themselves rather than relying on the god, but tries to steal immortality for them from the gods, and dies trying. Like Anton, tricksters intervene, almost as if to say this hard and fast rule about how gods shouldn't help humanity isn't always right, that sometimes they can, no, that they should, nay, they have a responsibility. Tricksters like Anton introduce this doubt, so perhaps the heaviest burden of a god isn't having to look down on suffering and not do anything, but the need for perfect judgment, figuring out those rare times where they should. Maybe we don't live in a perfectly fine-tuned universe, but one where God is desperately trying to hold it all together. It's a burden of wisdom, and are you really prepared to take that on? Should we even try? Some stories pose the burden of God here as impossible for us to even fully comprehend, let alone carry. Simply seeing God can literally turn people to ash. Surely trying to understand how they would think and feel would instantly drive us all mad. Fundamentally, throughout all of these stories, the burden of any god is one of sacrifice, carrying a burden humanity never has to, that perhaps we benefit from. Fantasy and mythology is full of gods sacrificing themselves for us to create the earth, the seas, the sky, even humanity itself. Quetzalcoatl cut himself and bled on bones and dirt to create humanity, or in Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn series, the god Preservation literally gives up part of his own soul to create humanity, sentient, thinking, feeling life, a decision which he knew would ultimately lead to his ruin. We cannot create without putting something of ourselves into our creation. A god's burden in that way can be one of unrequited love. Love never returned, and more painful for it. But I realized something when researching for this video, something which unites all of these gods, something which I couldn't stop thinking about, that fundamentally the greatest burden of a god, whatever form they take, is that they don't get to be human. Humans get to change and evolve. We are walking paradoxes. We are different people at every moment of our life, infinitely changeable. Where gods, on the other hand, often embody ideas, chaos, love, the sky, the underworld. And in some stories, they can't act outside of those ideas. They're limited by the very concepts they represent. Brandon Sanderson speaks to this in that same scene from that same book, where a character asks Harmony, who ties God's hands? The answer, he says, himself. Harmony is a mixture of the forces of ruin and preservation, the need for death, the need for life, and so even as someone murders their people, Harmony does nothing. I, the personality you speak to, agree with your indignation, says Harmony, but the powers that I am, the essence of myself, cannot allow me to take sides. Gods are bound by their divine nature, where humans are free to be paradoxes, contradictory and wrong within ourselves. We're a mess, but we're a free mess in ways gods often aren't. Remember that scene in Pirates of the Caribbean where Davy Jones is furious that Calypso, the goddess of the sea, didn't turn up on the one day he was meant to be with the love of his life?
You weren't there.
And why? It's in her nature, she says, to be unpredictable. The sea never makes promises. It's why when human characters ascend to godhood in these stories, it's often portrayed as a sacrifice, because they give up part of being human to become this new thing. In Elden Ring's Shadows of the Erdtree, Miquella wants to ascend to godhood, but has to, quote, abandon everything, his golden flesh, his blinding strength, even his fate. Or think about Bran Stark becoming closer to the old gods as the stories go on, but losing himself in that process, his human morality and view of the world just melting away. He becomes a new thing. Or there's Dr. Manhattan, who becomes this all-powerful, almost all-seeing godlike being, but in that transition loses the ability to find hope and wonder in the world the way he used to as a human. And he kinda hates it. How could he not? He can see the past, the present, and future all at once. These things feel decided to him. In one panel, he describes himself as a villain in a world full of hope, because hope depends on thinking the world can turn out differently, and maybe it's all decided to God. The world becomes predictable, ordinary for them. Manhattan tires of humanity's petty politics and struggles. The joys of a god are not the joys a human has. Humans are defined in part by our shared weaknesses, our shared strengths, shared community and world, of which gods can almost never share. Fantasy might be made up, but these stories are about very real things, and all of them, these tropes, reveal just how magical humans really are. We are some of the most remarkable creatures in the universe, with an infinite capacity for hope and wonder and magic and growth. We see the world in a unique way a god doesn't, and becoming a god means leaving something of that behind. Power can only be gained by letting go of something else, but that something else is arguably far more precious. Terry Pratchett tries to remind us that we don't live in a world belonging to gods. They live in a world we shape, one which ultimately is our responsibility. Maybe life would be easier if you were a god, but I don't think you would be human. I talk about fiction and writing and world building for a living, especially fantasy and science fiction. That is where my heart lies. But there is actually a whole other side to my career as a writer, professionally publishing work. I've worked on tabletop and board games, all sorts of stuff. But I'm also really passionate about education. That is why I make these videos, this channel, it's why it exists. And it's why I have compiled all of the educational videos that we have made, all these discussions that we've put together, and compiled them into these 3 on-writing and world-building books, which delve deeper and better than all the discussions that I get to have on YouTube. You know, I have to be thinking about the algorithm and thumbnails, and these really let me let loose. If you've enjoyed this kind of educational video or my other educational content, then these books are really pretty essential to pick up. These have a ton of extra analysis and discussion and examples, which I could just never fit into videos like these. These books are the next step after these videos, and I reckon you should pick them up at the link down below. 100,000 other people already have, and they seem to really be enjoying them, and I am really privileged that I get to share them with you. My aim is to make educational content accessible for people, and these are a fundamental part of that. I also could not make these videos without the people who read my fiction, you know, like my book, A Catalogue for the End of Humanity, which has a ton of great stories in it, including one, by the way, where a character becomes this godlike figure in a story called, a novelette called Trickle Down Lobotomies. It's probably one of my favorite stories I've ever written, as well as people who support me on Patreon. My patrons are amazing and a fundamental part of my business and always will be. Everyone who's read the story seems to love it, and if you've enjoyed this video, then I reckon you will too. That's all available down below. And then of course there's my patrons, who are the reason that I can keep doing this, that I can make content for them. And if you would like to join that community, join the Discord, then there are the links to that down below as well. It would really mean the world for you to support me and making this kind of stuff more available to more people around the world. I love doing what I do, and I'm very fortunate that I get to do it, but it is only possible because of people like you. Stay nerdy, and I will see you in the future.